Does jQuery belong in your Angular project? I'm contending that the answer is no, but let's take a look at how I arrived at this decision so you can make up your own mind. In order to answer this question, we need to take a look at what jQuery gets us. First, the biggie, DOM manipulation. As we've seen throughout this module, Angular has that covered. Anything jQuery can do in the DOM, Angular can do. After all, jQuery is just JavaScript sugar. But JavaScript and the browsers have mostly caught up to the point that we really don't need that sugar anymore. Next, event management. We haven't looked at it specifically in this course, but Angular has that covered as well. Ajax, Angular has that too. Async, promises and observables, both covered when you include RxJS. Animation, check. And that leaves plugins. jQuery has a rich plugin ecosystem, whereas Angular doesn't. But there are several open source component libraries for Angular that provide a lot of what the jQuery plugins offer. I'm not sure that any jQuery plugins are worth importing jQuery into your Angular project. Certainly you can, and people do, but this is not the Angular way and introduces all of the problems this module has shown us how to overcome. I'm not saying that jQuery is bad. It almost single-handedly catapulted JavaScript development from a lightweight also-ran to the juggernaut it is today. In its heyday, it was the technology to know. But now the world has changed. This is what I'm saying. In all the important ways, jQuery and Angular cover the same ground, and then Angular goes on much further. If you've decided that Angular is the right technology for a given need, then you've really also decided that jQuery is not. Don't try to jam it in. I'll stop pontificating now, but just realize that you really need to pick one, whichever you decide is the best for the task at hand, and run with it. Whatever you do, don't pick one just because it's what you know or because it's the shiny new object in the dev world. Make a conscientious choice for a given need, and you're going to be okay. Now, as I said in the slides, jQuery is not a bad library, but it really doesn't belong in an Angular project. We need to have some way of doing the things that jQuery lets us do. So let's see how we accomplish that in Angular. So we've got a couple of different scenarios we're going to take a look at. We'll take a look at showing and hiding elements, adding and removing content, adding and removing classes, adding and removing attributes, adding and removing styles, and registering and unregistering listeners. And those are typically the things that we use jQuery for. So let's see how we would accomplish those without jQuery, just straight Angular. Showing and hiding content, we can either actually show it or hide it, or we could use ngIf to add it and remove it from the DOM. And we talk about DOM cleanliness a little bit later in the course, but either of these are options for showing and hiding content. Taking a look at our code, a couple things to knock out of the way. The style sheet just has a couple supporting styles that we will make use of. The HTML itself, here's our first scenario, showing and hiding. We've got two buttons that both call flip UI. And we have our ngIf working off of an in-DOM boolean. And then we have the hidden attribute bound to a hidden variable. Calling flip UI just switches those, toggles them back and forth. So those are two different ways to add or remove content, make it visible or not visible in the UI. But we're not really touching the DOM. We are. Angular is for us. We're just writing JavaScript that updates variables. Next, adding and removing content. So I can click the button and have my content show up or disappear, depending on how I have things toggled. Again, looking at my HTML, this time I'm using binding. So I'm binding to the inner HTML of my div. What I'm binding there is a variable called bound content. Over here, I set up bound content to this value. And then when I click that button, I'm just changing based on this content visible. I'm changing the bound content value to either an empty string or my displayed string. So again, in these two examples, I'm really not directly manipulating the DOM. I'm changing JavaScript variables in my JavaScript code, and Angular is updating the DOM appropriately. In the next case, we start to touch the DOM a little bit more directly. So we're adding and removing a class. The class either highlights or unhighlights my div. In my HTML, here's my button. It's calling this toggle class. And you'll notice now for the first time I have a template reference variable on my div. We're going to make use of that inside the code. So let's go take a look at toggle class. Toggle class is going to work with a private variable I have set up called class lm. Well, what is that? Up here inside after view init, I make a call to this init elements. What that's going to do is take all of the view child properties that I have up top here and grab their native elements. Well, now you'll read a bunch of things online that talk about how you really shouldn't work with native element, which is a little bit misleading because it's not so much that you shouldn't work with them, just that you shouldn't directly access their properties. But there is a way to safely work with native element. So let's go take a look at how we do that. So we have all these different view child decorated properties that give us an element ref. We go down to init elements, and we're going saying, if we have a class, which is one of our properties, and it has a native element, then we're going to set up class element to be that native element. Same thing for the attribute, the style, and the listener. Okay, so those are all of our children that we specified up here, all the view child properties. So now we have class element representing the div. We have a Boolean that says, is the class turned on? If yes, then we're going to use the renderer2 and remove it. Now renderer2 was passed in. Where did our constructor go? Here we go. We passed renderer2 where we injected it in via our constructor. So we call remove class. We're going to work against the class lm property, which is our div. And we're going to remove the highlight class. When we're toggling the other way, we use add class and add highlight. And then we just toggle our class variable either on or off. So that gives us the toggling of this class to highlight or unhighlight. Similar for attribute. I have a button down here. When I click on the attribute button, this button gets disabled. Click it again and it toggles to enabled. So same type of thing. I have a native element here, and I'm removing the attribute disabled, or I'm setting the attribute disabled to a value of true. So that's how you would work with attributes using renderer2. Styling text, you can see I'm changing the color of it by clicking on the button. Similar approach, we have our native element that we've set up inside style lm, and we call either remove style or set style, depending on the value of our Boolean. When we're setting the style, we pass in the element that we want to apply it to. In this case, it's our native element that represents that style div. Here's the style that we want to set and the value we want to set it to. Remove style, we just pass in, say take out whatever value is in for color, just remove it entirely. And last, pretty typical thing to do with JQuery is register and deregister listeners. So you can see my listeners on or off. When it's on, when I run my mouse over my div, it changes colors. It just goes to a random color every time I move. I can turn it off, and the color changing goes away. We saw doing this with host listener earlier, but here's a different way that we could register listeners. The first thing we're going to look at is actually when listener on is false. That's when we set up our listener. We're going to store the return value from the renderer2 listen function in this listener func, which we declared up top here, right here. So we call renderer2.listen. We say, here is the element in my DOM that I want to listen to. Here is the event that I want to listen to. And what I want to do is call this listen function and pass in the event parameter that I got from the browser. Listen down here is just adding a style, where it's just adding the background color. Okay, so that's my event handler. Now the interesting thing is the return value from listen, from the renderer2.listen method, gets stored in this listener func. We now have a function registered as a listener. If we want to unregister that or deregister that, we just call that return value, and it's going to deregister the listener. So this is what essentially turns off my listener when I need to. Typically, you would do something like this in an ng destroy, but you could do it at whatever point your requirements call for it to be done. So that shows working with Angular and just plain JavaScript, specifically in a lot of cases working with the renderer2, but sometimes not really interacting with the DOM at all. Like I said, in these first couple things, we were just working with JavaScript variables and letting Angular update the DOM and update the view appropriately. But that's how you can do a lot of the things that we typically in the past would have used JQuery for in an Angular environment. And it keeps us separated. It keeps our DOM and our backend separate from our UI and the view that the user is interacting with.